the United States should require universal background checks for all gun sales and transfers of ownership. Gun control contributes to three following effects. First is an increase in trafficking. Executive The Guardian writes in October that gun control laws in Colorado had little measurable effect due to the lack of both compliance and enforcement. This is compounded by the growth of the black market in scenarios with increased gun control. Isaac of the New York Times posits in 2015 that the effect of state laws has been significantly diluted by a thriving underground market for firearms brought in from states with fewer restrictions, discovering that about 50,000 guns are found to be diverted to criminals across state lines each year. Michelle of the Hill corroborates in 2013 that nearly 80% of crime guns are already outside of retail distribution channels, and Kurtz Levin of NPR finds in October that more than 60% of new guns used in Chicago, a city with comparatively stringent gun laws and gang-related crimes, were brought in from other states. Wayne of NPR notes in 2015 that charging these types of loopholes falls towards the bottom of federal prosecutors' priority lists. This results in complacency, in which background checks are viewed as the end-all solution, but in reality, guns continue to cross the borders of states with a weaker enforcement of gun control policies. Second is a pro-gun panic. As of recent history, even talks of gun control have resulted in dramatic retaliation. Adati of Fortune writes in 2016 that in response to the Pulse shooting and subsequent calls for gun control, gun sales surged by 40% in 3 out of the first 6 months of 2016. Keller of the New York Times furthers in 2015 that fear of gun buying restrictions is the main driver of spikes in gun sales. And Hahn of the New York Times even finds in October that as a reaction to the Las Vegas shooting, share prices of major gun manufacturers rose. Finally, Lamier of Newsweek writes in October that in the wake of the Sandy Hook shooting, the NRA raised what was then a record 350% increase in donations for its political action committee. The impact is twofold. A is an increase in protective legislation. Problematically, Pew Research finds in 2013 that gun rights activists are more than 4 times as likely to have contributed money to an organization that took a position on the issue of guns than advocates in favor of gun control. This contributes to direct policy change, in which after Sandy Hook, massive donations to the NRA successfully struck down a bill to expand background checks in 2013. B is a stronger alt-right. Alex Yablon writes for Vice in 2016, explaining that in the case of the alt-right, guns are both a symbol of conflict and a means of provocation. Mark Koch of Salon furthers in August that groups like the NRA capitalize on paranoia and fear, inciting violence in order to advance an increasingly radical more guns for anyone, anywhere agenda. Consequently, Morgan of the Washington Post finds in 2016 that the rate of radicalization of the alt-right has been increasing exponentially, with its social media content 25% more radicalized at the midpoint of the year than the beginning. Third is lobbyist backlash. Historically, policies that restrict gun ownership have been counterproductive in the overarching gun control movement. The Washington Post elaborates in 2012 that in 2004, after a 10-year temporary assault weapons ban, each attempt to renew the legislation was shot down in Congress. Rather, later that same year, legislation was passed to grant immunity to gun manufacturers in civil suits, a win for the NRA. Tao of Politico thus writes in 2013 that Clinton himself conceded that passing the ban devastated more than a dozen Democratic lawmakers in the 1994 midterms, which Riley of the Atlantic contextualizes led to the loss of Congress to the Republicans in 1994, the first time Democrats have lost control in 40 years, deterring future congressional members from prioritizing gun control as a national issue. The impact is dangerous and that it exhausts political capital. Halper of the LA Times warns in 2015 that gun control doesn't have the voter intensity it needs. Rather, their efforts do more to energize interest groups like the NRA. Beckett specifies that gun control in Colorado and Washington resulted in millions of dollars spent just for 2 Colorado Democrats to lose their seats, furthering that years of pushing for compromise solutions have only moved the discussion further and further to the right by pushing for more watered-down policies. Let's engage.
Is everyone ready? We affirm resolved that the U.S. should require universal background checks for all gun sales and transfers of ownership. Contention 1 is decreasing gun homicides. Universal background checks would reduce criminals' access to guns for 3 main reasons. First, choking off the black market. Webster at the New Republic in 2014 explains that when criminals get guns, they get them from friends, family, or from underground market sources. Without universal background check requirements, there is little deterrent to selling these guns to these criminals. Background checks deter the diversion of guns to criminals because with greater accountability measures, street prices will rise and fewer dangerous people will have guns. But second, through decreasing private sale loopholes. Kessler at Third Way in 2013 writes that under current law, it is illegal for a private individual to sell to felons, but only if it can be proven that the seller knew that the buyer was prohibited from buying. This free pass to sell to anyone using the defense that you didn't know that he was an ex-con is the lubricant that makes the shadow market crimes gun flow. A simple background check requirement would eliminate the high bar of knowing and would make all sales occur under the same set of rules. For example, Vites at the BMG Medical Journal finds in 2013 that nearly 3 of 10 gun offenders would have been prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms when committing their most recent offense if the states had stricter prohibitions. Third, increasing enforcement. Kessler explains that such a system would provide law enforcement with the means to stop individuals from participating in suspicious transactions in the current system, in which police are powerless to intervene when they observe what happens in the suspect and when they suspect sales. Universal background checks provide police with a necessary tool to help sort out transfers between law-abiding citizens and transfers of guns to dangerous criminals. Fourth is stopping state spillover. Several states require background checks for private sales. However, those laws are undetermined by criminals who can buy guns in states with less regulation and then bring them into the other states. According to The Economist in 2015, in Chicago, which has restrictive gun laws, more than half of guns confiscated by the police come out of state. Cross-state spillover leads to more guns in the hands of criminals and more gun deaths. Whitcomb at Reuters in 2017 finds that firearms-related deaths increased 70% in parts of California in the direct weeks after gun shows in Nevada, which has fewer regulations. Overall, a universal background check would reduce gun homicides. The Giffords Law Center finds that states that required background checks on all handgun sales had 35% fewer gun deaths per capita than states without background check requirements, and even less than half as many mass shooting incidents. Scaled up on a national level, a UBC would be similarly effective. Carroll at Boston University finds in 2016, if a law for universal background checks was implemented on the federal level, overall firearm mortality would reduce by 57%. Contention 2 is suicides. Every Town for Gun Safety in 2015 explains that people with severe mental illnesses are at a substantially increased risk of suicide, and partially as a result, they are federally prohibited from buying guns under a universal background check. Mensimer at Mother Jones in 2013 furthers that mandatory background checks can make a big difference in preventing suicide. Suicide is often an impulsive act and one that people haven't given much thought. If some in a crisis simply don't have access to a gun quickly, they may not try suicide at all, or they may try a less lethal means that offers more chance that they'll be saved. That's why he finds that states with universal background checks have a gun suicide rate 50% lower than states who don't. Are you ready for the first call?
Yeah.
Do you use your phone to time?
Yeah. Okay, everybody ready? Can you explain the warrant to your third reason why background checks work?
Enforcement?
Yeah.
Kessler tells you that it's very hard for police to actually like survey the difference between when you give criminals guns and when you give regular people guns, right? Because there's no like law that goes in between the states that can do that. But what he specifically says is that when you introduce a universal background check, it actually gives police the means to actually enforce that
Who
law.
enforces
Can I ask you?
background checks?
The police. Can I ask you a question? Your impact of watering down background checks.
Yeah.
How does this manifest?
Like in terms of, once you pass background checks, any other gun control policies that we try and push, the NRA is just going to like emphasize rollbacks and water down future gun control. Like, what other gun control policies exist?
How would they water down universal background checks, which is literally just a checklist to make sure you're not a felon or
I'm
you
saying
have a
like in
mental
terms of
illness?
future gun control past background checks, those policies will be watered down.
Okay, so like what, right? Because I don't see how those water down, how does that manifest
Okay,
in
for
actual
example,
policy,
the
right?
1994 assault weapons ban that I gave you, that caused such backlash that after the 10-year temporary period in which it was implemented, it was shut
Oh.
down, and then protective legislation was passed that like granted gun manufacturers civil immunity.
So actually, you use that in Tao, which I have another problem with. You say that like the impact of Clinton introducing the anti-assault ban was very, very bad for his own policy, right?
Yeah.
Is the difference between what is the difference between an anti-assault ban and a universal background check?
Like I don't I would argue there's not much difference in terms of like it's gun control that like largely doesn't work, but it was really just a name that made it like popular.
Wait, why does it not work? It was a complete ban.
It was an assault weapons ban. It was an assault weapons ban.
And that's completely different than universal
No, it
background
didn't
check
work
because people can still have access to guns under a universal background check,
It didn't
right?
work because assault weapons were only 2% of violent crimes like committed with gun violence.
But
So,
what
like,
you're trying to tell
it was
me
just
is that
assault weapons,
Clinton
not
lost his
all guns.
support because of this ban on weapons. We're not
Assault
arguing for a
weapons,
ban
there's
on
a
weapons.
difference.
We're only arguing for a ban on criminals getting weapons with under universal background checks. That solves for that.
Okay, can I have a question?
Yes.
Is there even enforcement of background checks?
Would there be?
Yeah.
Yes, that's what Kessler tells you. Can I ask another really quick question?
Kind of follow-up real quick to that. Okay, so if that's true, why have we seen that states like Colorado and Washington literally did not enforce background checks at all?
What? How do they not enforce background checks?
There was no rise in
First of all,
background checks,
Kessler
and that's
tells
what
you
Beckett
that
tells
when
you
you
the
put it
Colorado case.
on the federal level, due to the proper or the supremacy clause, what happens is the states have to follow that federal law. Can I really just quickly clarify on
Sure.
question? Why would people scurry for guns if they see that there's going to be more regulations in the future?
That's because the right really likes their guns, and anytime they threaten that, they think that they're not in the future they're not going to have the chance to buy those guns, so they panic and they buy
Will
all the guns.
law-abiding citizens ever have the threat of not getting their guns
No, but that's
under a universal background?
that. I mean,
No, so they don't feel the threat
there's
of
two
gaining their guns.
responses to that. They're worried about a slippery slope, and second of all, we still see a 40% increase.
So you prep?
Yeah.
So it's going to be an overview at the top of Pro, and then Sean. Is anyone not ready? Starting off with an overview, you have to recognize that if checks don't work, they can't garner any offense off of their flow. There's a few reasons that this is true. The first is that it's rarely enforced. This is quantified by the New York Times, who states that in Illinois, when a gun registry was placed in policy, there was no compliance of over 2/3, and on a statewide non-compliance, there was over 75%. Likewise, in Cleveland city authorities estimated that the rate of compliance with registration laws were just under 12%. Brooke Seaman corroborates this with Fox News, who explains that the background checks were enacted in Washington and Colorado. A lack of enforcement led to little to no effect. But second, surface level prevention. According to the Law of Dallas Morning News, 96% of cases that were stopped were prohibited purchases. The ban was stopped after the first two stages. Under the Brady Act, the 8% of cases that will have a dirty background check will be dropped in the next 3 days if they can't resolve the dirty background. But third, according to Paparatino from the New York Times, there will be a lack of reporting because mental health records are underwhelmingly reported to the overall database. And finally, a small scope, because Michael of the Hill finds that 80% of crime guns are distributed under the table. This means that overall they're already coming from the black market, which means that they're not actually stopping back to the black market whenever they say that they bring it to whenever they say that they can get people to comply with background checks. But now let's go on to the body of their case, where they talk about 4 warrants to why people are deterred. First, they talk about an increase in prices, but they're only increasing $50 to $80 because that's how much a background check costs. And insofar as people are already criminals, their priorities are skewed, and they only want the background to commit the crimes. And B, people are already criminals, so they're not going to be deterred by this. But then they talk about how they're closing the loopholes. But there's a few problems with this. First, their only link in here is that that background checks work. So even if you buy our review, they don't have any offense here. But even if you don't buy that, you can turn the argument, because with the NRA, you can cross-apply our case here, where we tell you that they will respond with in the future with watering down these policies. Dennis Hannigan from the Huffington Post finds that explains that in times of federal reform, the NRA has struck back hard with reactionary policies to roll back gun control. And so far as even if they can pass this bill past Congress, they can't actually get it to be effective. But then they it's ineffective again because according to Matthews from Denver Post in Colorado, state statistics are one recent study suggesting that the efforts have limited impact. Insofar as all of their studies and all of the reasons that they give you for a decrease in homicides are corrupt, because they tell you they're in states that have other gun restrictive laws. This is through permit to purchase laws, or having to take courses before you can get a gun. And insofar as their states aren't these studies are not specifically because of universal background checks, they're not slowing back things on a federal level. But then in a joint investigation with California and John Hopkins, the Colorado and Washington who recently implemented background checks. Again, like you see this corrupt study. But finally, you can cross-apply our fourth point to the overview where we tell you that 80% of guns are already coming off of the black market. But then if you go on to subpoint B, they talk about stopping state spillover. Insofar as we prove complacency, we would tell you is that you only have one chance to pass a good policy, and insofar as checks are not a good policy, you're not actually solving any problems. And finally, they talk about how they're solving back for homicides and stuff, but what we would tell you is that the issue is straw purchases, not interstate trafficking, and insofar as you can still get someone with a clean background check to buy you a gun, you're not actually solving back for anything, even if they tell you that they close the loop with law enforcement. Criminals are still criminals. And now let's move on to their second contention about suicides. There's a few responses here. The first is that you can only be committed, you can only not have a gun if you're forced to commit to a mental institution. This is really critical because insofar as people with suicidal tendencies usually don't tell people, insofar as they can't be forced by court order or by family members to commit to a mental institution, so you're not actually solving the problem. But then even if you go to the state level, they're not actually committing this information to the databases, which means that the databases aren't going to cause them to come up with a dirty background check, which means that they're going to be able to get a gun anyway. They're not stopping suicide or the root of the problem because they're not actually stopping people's mental issues. They're only stopping after they've already decided they want to commit suicide. And insofar as that is true, they have other ways to commit suicide. So insofar as they're only taking away guns, they're causing them to either go to the black market, get guns from family or friends, or use other mechanisms. And insofar as background checks don't work, there's no way that they can garner any confidence.
Can I see the evidence about watering down background checks?
Yeah.
So just for the sake of clarity, I'm going to be starting on our case, on her general responses, and then I'll go to their case. And I'll sign this as I go along. Okay. Everyone ready? Cool. Let's begin. Let's start on our case. My opponent says that there won't be enforcement because in Illinois and in Colorado and Washington, there haven't been enforcement. None of these responses really apply to today's debate, because today's debate concerns federal implementation of federal law. And states have to follow federal law, otherwise, as Nick says, they have a constitutional crisis on their hands. And unless these states are willing to enter a constitutional crisis, they're probably going to enforce. Let's look at history, right? The Brady Bill passed in 1994 was a federal compliance law that forced all states to conduct background checks for licensed vendors. Notice, there was no non-compliance with this because it was a federal law. The Brady Bill is everywhere all the time, which means that their compliance argument doesn't make a lot of sense on a federal level. Second, she says that still dealers will give to people because the 8% of sales that aren't stopped go to dirty people. That ignores the 95 or the 92% of sales that are confirmed within seconds, which means that the vast majority of background checks happen in minutes or seconds and work. Then they talk about this idea of scope. They say that 80% of sales are done under the table. That's fine. But that's really important, though, because it means that most sales are done legally and they're straw purchases. However, they drop Webster, who explains that when you adopt background checks, that increases the cost of all guns, which means that straw purchases, the cost transfers to criminals, which means the cost goes up, which means that less criminals have access to guns. Go to their case. Go to their first warrant on the black market. Go to where they say that there's lack of enforcement, crossed by my earlier response, which is that on a federal level, you will see enforcement. That's the first response. Second, all their evidence about going from state to state in Chicago does not happen in a universal background check world. Here's the reason why. Cross-apply our fourth warrant, right? The only reason why Chicago gets guns from other states is because those states don't have universal background check systems. When you have a nationwide background check, all of those states have the same amount of laws, so there is no discontinuity. Everyone has the same laws, so their black market argument goes away. But third, even if you don't buy that, Webster explains that the increase in price decreases the amount of guns that are available to criminals on the black market because the cost gets transferred on. That's why Sargent finds that in states without universal background checks, gun trafficking is 30% higher. In their world, without background checks, you see more guns flowing on the black market. Go to their second warrant, which talks about increasing panic. First of all, they say that there's a lot of paranoia about gun control. Maybe that's true about gun control in general, not about universal background checks. According to what new, 82% of gun owners support universal background checks. Those people aren't very paranoid because they agree that these are just sensible and rational policies that anyone probably should have to reduce gun deaths. Second off, even if it is true, even if there is some paranoia, this is inherently short-term, because the nature of why they're buying guns is because they won't be able to once there's a background check, which means that once the background check is implemented, this all goes away. And when you're looking to the when, right, a short-term spike in gun deaths is nowhere near a long-term decrease in the overall gun deaths. Remember, Cal Stanu says that there's a 57% decrease nationwide in gun deaths with universal background checks. Go to their impacts, though. Their first impact concerns legislation. And they say that the NRA is going to mobilize support to decrease the efficacy of background checks. This doesn't make a lot of sense either, because according to Whitney, 72% of NRA members also like universal background checks, which means that at best you'll get NRA infighting, with NRA extremists on the right wanting to pass these restrictive policies, and then people who actually support background checks resisting them. So their impact here is either non-existent or very marginal, because the NRA can't mobilize supporters who don't support their policies. Go to their second impact, though, which talks about energizing the alt-right. Cross-applied with me again, but second, and even more importantly, this is a very small fraction of overall gun crime. There are 33,000 deaths due to gun crime every year, and what we say is we're going to reduce the vast majority of that, even if the alt-right gets somewhat more guns. Go to their third warrant, though, on increasing lobbyists and these more rollback policies. Again, first off, cross-applied with me here, that there's at most infighting, the NRA doesn't get to pass these policies with UBCs. But second, and perhaps more importantly, even if other gun control policies are repealed, that doesn't matter. Because according to Cooper, in a survey of experts, there is a unanimous consensus that universal background checks are the best gun control policy, are the most effective in reducing gun homicides. So even if other policies are repealed, the fact that universal background checks come in is still sufficient.
Okay, so like going on to like where you talk about how 72% of the NRA supports gun like ownership. What was the sample size for that study?
Not sure, I'm sure you can tell me.
169 people. Insofar as like that's number one a poll and number two the sample size is minuscule, how is that representative of number one how like the NRA interacts with the Congress, and B how NRA like will actually interact with like as a whole?
I can go back and read the poll. I'm pretty sure when I cut it, it said that this is a nationally representative survey. But even if it's not, you don't provide a counter piece of evidence. So this one is the one that we're going to go with. Also, we can look to just logically why people would support it. That UBCs just generally have more supportist policies because they don't take away guns from anyone. So they just stop it from getting into the hands of criminals.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
So you talk about how like Americans support it as well. Insofar as like Americans are given a poll and they're asked if criminals should have guns, obviously they would say that criminals shouldn't have guns. So like asking people if like they support that policy option is like going to be obvious that like almost 100% of Americans think that criminals shouldn't have guns because obviously they don't want to die.
So
what I would say is that like they don't really aren't like educated about how this like policy.
Start off with Sydney's overview. Remember, PAL 13 tells you that there's extreme underreporting with the system. That's because states aren't submitting their information. That's really problematic because this just creates complacency in which we think we're solving the problem, but in reality, the information in the system to conduct background checks isn't even there. But then, extending Hill, who tells you that background checks is only going to expand to 9% of firearm transactions. Insofar as that's such a tiny part, that's why background checks aren't going to be enough alone. But then on cost, remember that cost is going to be minimal and like doesn't even matter to criminals. We're not going to take that into consideration. But then extending NRA turn from Hennigan, who tells you that when we pass gun control, there's increased NRA rollback. This is really problematic when in the first place we're only altering 9% of transactions, but if that just is like subjected to rollback, then we're not actually creating a significant change. But then move on to the con case. First of all, on he says that UBCs or 82% of gun owners support background checks. But the problem is the other 18% is extremely vocal. That's why Adati tells you that in 2016 we saw a 40% increase in gun sales and there's extreme stockpiling, which just creates like the environment for more gun culture and more gun violence. But then he says that 72% of the NRA support gun control. The problem is the sample size was only 169. That's not representative of the NRA. Their policies are more so. That's why in 2013 we saw that their lobbying with the increased funding of 350%, they were able to shoot down background checks. That just proves the influence and power of the NRA. That's why we shouldn't just pass a weak policy. But then he says on the alt-right impact that that's just a small fraction of violence. But this extremism is exactly what gains media attention and is exactly what hurts the gun control movement as a whole, all at the cost of just a weak policy. But then on the last point on lobbyist backlash, he says that there's just going to be infighting within the NRA, but that's not what we saw in 2013. They were able to effectively shoot down the background check policy. That shows their influence. But then on this Cooper turn, that UBCs are seen as the best thing, this concedes complacency, which is really problematic because it means other gun control isn't going to happen if we see universal background checks as the best thing. That's really problematic when, once again, the Hill tells you that it only expands to 9% of transactions. Insofar as and 80% of transactions are conducted illegally. Insofar as that's true, we're not passing a good policy and we're stopping right there.
We're gonna run.
Is everyone ready?
we go to Nick.
Starting off with this overview, remember that Cooper tells you that the best policy and the only alternative is universal background checks. So even if there's a complacency that doesn't respond to Cooper, but then they try to tell you that there's 9% of transactions is not important. But what Webster tells you is that those 9% of transactions account for all of the private transfers towards criminals, which create the gun crimes in the first place, and that's really critical because they're not actually decreasing any gun size. Onto their case, remember that they don't respond to how like all of this, their entire case is short term. Because remember that after the UBC is implemented, they people will no longer be able to buy all of these guns. But then second of all, remember that NRA members don't even want UBCs. They try to tell you that the sample size is too small, so you can't even look at that. But remember that they're based in their foundation that the vast majority of people in the country, in fact 82%, find that they don't want that they do want UBCs because they think that it's going to decrease homicides. Therefore, you don't even look to their case because what we tell you is that it decreases homicides for two reasons. First is our first link. What we tell you is that when you decrease the supply in the legal market, you increase the prices for that. Webster tells you that when you do this, they try to tell you that it's like $50 to $80 to increase the price of the guns. Although Webster tells you that that's actually enough to deter criminals from getting them. They try to tell you that straw purchases will go around this, but it doesn't because Webster tells you that when you increase the cost of all guns in the long term, it also increases them in the black market. That means that without UBCs, you see an increase in 30% of trafficking of guns. Then they try to tell you that onto state spillover. Remember, The Economist tells you that half of the guns confiscated in Chicago were from out of state. And then Giffords tells you that when you introduce UBCs, you decrease the deaths from the guns that are going into states by 35%. They completely ignore the example of California. It tells you that there was an increase in mortality by 70% for gun deaths when after gun shows that happened in Nevada. This is happening in the status quo. They try to tell you that you can't even look to these state studies because it doesn't work. But Kailson tells you that when you implement these on the federal level due to the supremacy clause, what you see is that a decrease in mortality of 57% is really, really critical. You've been weighing mortality over all of these policy changes, first based on areas of irreversibility, right? Policy changes you can reverse them, but the second on magnitude, you're taking away people's lives and mortality.
Let's do it.
So let's go back to who enforces background checks. How does the law enforcement enforce the background check?
How does law enforcement? Sure, good question. So law enforcement go to gun stores and they check if the vendors are selling to people who have background checks or don't.
Okay.
The undercover has to.
It's ultimately the vendors, though, right, who have the responsibility of conducting the background checks. The law enforcement can check.
Sure, but vendors don't break federal law. That's just majority of vendors don't break federal law to sell these guns.
Right, because
that's what happens in states of background checks. They just follow the law.
Now that there's a law, that means you increase the accountabilities on the vendors so they don't want to get into trouble, so they don't sell to those criminals.
May I ask you a question? I want to ask about complacency. So why is complacency bad?
Because I would argue that, considering that background checks only span to 9% of firearm transactions, then background checks aren't the end-all solution.
So what are the solutions?
Things like safe storage laws, safety training classes, permit to purchase laws, which a lot of your studies don't take into account for in isolating background checks in the efficacy.
So those would decrease gun deaths more than a universal background check.
Well, a lot of those would be packaged with a background check, right? But
So if they're combined, it's better?
It would also fill in the holes that background checks could possibly leave, first of all. And second of all, what you fail to recognize is the fact that because you can see to the complacency turn, we don't have another chance in the future to be able to pass more meaningful
So
policies.
if we win that UBCs, because in neither world we're going to have both, right? Because either your world where we don't have UBCs or these policies, or in our world where we have UBCs but not these policies.
You have a chance, and your world.
All right, sure, you have a chance. So if we win that UBCs are effective by themselves, does it matter if these other policies are passed?
Yeah. Because you put a dent in the gun control movement as a whole. Whenever you say that
This is probably, but UBC is probably the biggest win for a gun control movement in 40 years. I mean, it's literally the most effective policy.
It's been their number one goal.
Okay, so let's look at the states that have UBCs. What was one of the statistics that you read about mortality rates decreasing?
It's a 35% decrease in states that have
Did that take into
background
account
checks.
these states that have UBCs but also have permit to purchase laws and other laws associated?
Yeah,
with
I mean
that?
they isolate for
study
background
that
checks,
you
but also
Do
even
they
if it's
really?
even if
not
it's correlative, right? We can look to the reasons for why UBC does, which are that it's
So
simply.
why is it a UBC and not these other things?
Yeah,
Why do those
sure.
things have no effect?
Yeah, great question. Just simply because it increases the price of guns, which means that those prices are passed on to potential criminals. So criminals are far less likely to buy guns that are just too expensive and out of their price
why
range.
But then it
Price
also
deter-
stops state spillover, which you haven't really responded to.
Why does price deter a criminal but not conducting a crime deter a criminal?
Sorry?
Why would $50 matter to somebody who's going to kill somebody?
Because they simply cannot afford it. I mean, we say that states that don't have UBCs have 30% higher rates of these kind of illegal movements
Okay, hold on.
of gun
If
trafficking.
you say that $50 to $80 is enough to but you don't prove a bright line here as to why that extra $50 is going to deter them from buying a gun.
Sure, I mean,
whether they
because
really want to kill
sure, because
someone.
if your job is to commit crime, or not if your job, but if that is your MO, if that is all you have, you probably don't have a lot of money, and that
But
extra
why is
$50 could be a lot.
$50 the bright line?
I'm sorry?
Because the price increases.
So it's just going to be overview program. Is anyone not ready? Starting off with the overview where he tries to respond with Cooper, but this is a really detrimental mistake because he doesn't provide you a warrant here. He says that UBCs are the last base policy, but he doesn't explain to you why, and I'll get to that in a second. Then he tells you that the only link in here is to decreasing homicides is an increase in prices. But here he doesn't provide you a bright line. He tells you that $50 is going to stop criminals from killing people, but this disregards the fact that A, they're already criminals, and B, they really have their priorities skewed if they're wanting to buy a gun to kill someone anyway and waste their money on that. But now let's move down further on the floor where they talk about how straw purchases are not enough. First of all, they concede that straw purchases happen in their world, and B, whenever you have a 40% increase in sales after you have the NRA rhetoric after this policy is passed, you only mitigate all of their impacts even more. But then they go on to these studies about how they decrease homicide. There's really big flaws in these, and in that the states that have background checks right now also have permit to purchase laws and all these other laws that we advocate for in the future. And so far as whenever you go into the pro world, you're only passing this one faulty policy, and you don't have any chance of passing any future policies as a whole, and you dent the gun control movement, which means that you have short-term really bad solvency. But now let's go on to the conflict where there's a few problems. First of all, he tries to say that they can stop people from buying guns, and then he responds to the NRA survey, the NRA and DIKE, by saying that people like UBCs. This is really not responsive, A, because it's only a poll, and obviously people don't want people to have criminals because he doesn't back up his study here. But B, what we would say is that even if people support these policies, we would say that the most effective policies come whenever you vote con. Now let's go down further on the floor where you can extend the fact that whenever you have this in 2013, whenever we had the policy hit the floor and you had this policy being almost being passed, you had a 350% increase in NRA funding. This is really bad because what we would say is that because this gets a bunch of media attention, which means that the pro-gun movement only strengthens even more. This is really bad because what we would say is that it dents the ability in the future to pass really effective legislation, which are these national permit to purchase laws. Then they say that Webster is what stops all criminals, but this is really critical because what we would respond with is the Brady Act, who says that in this last 8% who we are going to extend to background checks are the criminals who have dirty background checks, and if it takes more than 8 days or 3 days to clear their background, it means that they can get the gun anyway. The Brady Act is really detrimental here because it takes out all of their solvency. Don't buy any of their respects.
Okay. I'm going to start on their case. Our case. Is everyone ready? This debate boils down to reducing gun deaths. My opponents come up here and give a very long story. They say that there's going to be paranoia, the NRA is going to mobilize, that's going to decrease these other measures. None of this matters, right? For two reasons. First of all, because they don't even tell you why these measures are good. They just say we'll have less gun control, but they don't give you a single evidence, not a single iota or statistic or stat that says why these policies are good or preferable over UBCs. And they drop Cooper, who says that most experts agree that UBCs are the best policy. So just on an evidential basis, we're winning because even if these policies are rolled back, having a UBC is better for reducing crime. But second, they ask why. Cooper doesn't give a warrant. Sure, let's go to our case to explain why this decreases crime. Two reasons. First of all, because we say the simple rule of supply and demand, right? That right now there's an over high supply of guns. There are too many guns on the market and they're too cheap. And straw purchasers have no reason to not give guns to criminals. However, UBCs increase the cost of guns, which means that the amount that the straw purchasers pay is transferred onto criminals, which is why Webster finds that criminals now have to pay more for guns. And eventually, when you look at supply and demand curves, when the demand gets too high, when the price gets too high, supply drops off. Less and less criminals will buy guns. Sure, some still will, but there will be substantial reductions. That's why he finds that in states without background checks, there is a 30% increase in the number of gun trafficking. Second, we close the state-by-state loophole. Remember that in some states there are uneven gun laws, which is why in Nevada you can go into and buy a gun at a gun store and then go back to California, which is why you see a 70% increase in gun deaths. However, if they all have the same law, which are UBCs, it's all under the same playing field, which means that you won't see an increase in gun deaths. Overall, remember that Calisan says that there is a 57% decrease nationwide in background checks. They say this doesn't isolate their other laws. Their defense on this is quite mitigatory. Maybe that's true, but right, A, Calisan isolates for background checks specifically, but B, even if it's correlated, right, having some measured background checks, having some protection is still better than their policies, because their policies literally have no efficacy. At least in our world, we're showing that empirically, background checks have worked in the past and are more likely to work in the future than their policies, which really have never been proven to work. Good enough.